Now, as we were saying, what was particularly interesting is that there seems to be a dissociation between parts of the brain interested in the what, in the identity, in the ventral stream, so in temporal cortex, versus parts of the brain that seem to be more concerned with taking that early visual information and extracting from it position in space, so where. And one nice demonstration of this was done in a non-human primate model by Mishkin and Ungerleider in 1982. So there were two different monkeys. One had a damage to the what stream, so in temporal cortex, and you can see this monkey had a damage down here, down in temporal cortex, so down the what stream. A second animal instead had a damage up here in the parietal lobe, in the so-called where stream. And then they had these animals perform two different types of tasks. In one task, they'd be shown in different trials, different objects, and the task was to recognize whether the object was the same as in the prior trial. Turned out, predictably, the monkey that had a lesion to the what area, to the what pathway rather, was unable to perform this task much better than chance. On the other hand, the monkey that had a lesion to the where pathway had no trouble recognizing when one object was the same in a trial as in the one before. Now, you get the exact opposite pattern when you have the animals not recognize objects, but recognize whether the position of an object on a desk was the same across trials. So for example, in one trial, the item might be here. The question is, in the next trial, is the item in the same position or not? Turned out you get the exact reverse. The animal that has a damage to the where pathway couldn't quite tell, wasn't better than chance at recognizing if the object was in the same position as the trial before or not. Whereas the animal that had impairment to the what pathway had no trouble recognizing whether the position was the same or not. Again, demonstrating this dissociation between the dorsal and the ventral streams, in other words, the what and the where pathways. Now, in 1994, Jim Haxby and colleagues at the NIH showed the exact same principle, but in humans. What they did is they had healthy volunteers go inside a PET machine, which is a way of looking at the metabolism, so trying to understand what parts of the brain become metabolically active when we engage in some kind of mental activity. And they were shown a display such as this one. Now, half the times in the so-called face matching task, participants would have to look at the face in the top of this screen, and then tell which of the other two faces matched the identity of the top face. So in a sense, this is a what task? It's a task in which you have to understand, you have to process the identity of the stimuli and recognize which are the two that match. So this is the what task, or the face matching task. Now, the other half of the time, participants were shown a similar screen, but your task is to tell, if you look at this layout, which of these two layouts matches this one. In other words, if you were to look at the small square here, in which of these two layouts is the small square in the same position with respect to the two bars? So you might notice, for example, that if you take this and you rotate, the position of the square will match this display right here. This is a where task. This is a task in which you have to understand where is the position of the little square with respect to the two long bars. So the beauty of this experiment is that given the exact same stimulus, you can do both the what and the where task. And then you look at what parts of the brain are particularly active doing the what task and what parts of the brain are particularly active doing the where task. And it turns out, exactly as we now expect, that the what task elicited activation down here, exactly in temporal cortex. And in fact, this piece right here overlaps with the face fusiform area. And I'm sorry for this little shading. Unfortunately, the original coloring is red and green. So just on the off chances that there's somebody who is a red-green blind, I recolored the bottom one as blue. So when you're doing the what task, it engages the what stream, the ventral part, the ventral stream. When instead you're doing the where task, it's the dorsal part of the brain that gets particularly excited. So indeed, the where stream. Now, however, it's not that easy in the sense, as I said at the outset of this part of our slide, the dorsal stream is not only about where, but it's also about how. And this was shown in a very beautiful way by Goodale and Milner in 1991. See, they were interested in patients who had differential damage, either at in the dorsal stream or in the ventral stream, until they noted one particular patient, known as DF, that exhibited a different type of impairment. Now, she had a ventral damage, so she had a classic impairment in terms of what? What was different with her was the result of the damage to the dorsal stream. See, for example, sometimes she would be shown a line such as this one, and just asked to reproduce the orientation of this line. Now, if you ask, or rather, she was shown a second line, and she had to choose when the second line matched the orientation of this one. Now, if you ask a number of healthy volunteers, and indeed, if you do this yourself, you can see that healthy volunteers are pretty good with choosing lines that pretty much match this orientation. Now, if you ask the F to do the same task, she seems to be unable. These are the lines that she chose to match this orientation. But here's the apparently paradoxical behavior that she exhibits. If instead of doing this, you give her a little block of wood and tell her, look, this is the letter, just post it through the slit. She can do this pretty well. See, if I were to ask you to do this, if I gave you a letter and asked you to post it, you would be able to match well the orientation of the slit to put in the letter. If you give this block to the F and you tell her, okay, put this block through the slit as if it were a letter, she becomes pretty good. So this was the first demonstration that the dorsal cortex, the dorsal pathway, is not just about where something is in space, but is also about how do you interact with objects in your environment. Now, a demonstration of this double dissociation in humans, the dissociation between the ventral pathway and the dorsal pathway, you can see it by contrasting two different patients. Now, one is patient DF, who we just saw, and as you remember, she has a damage to the what pathway, but she seems to have her how pathway intact. Conversely, patient RV, who has ataxia, she has an intact what pathway, but she sustained damage to the occipital and parietal part of her brain, which means the dorsal pathway. And now these two patients were asked to do two different types of tasks. One task is known as a recognition task. And they were shown, so these are little marbles, and they were shown different marbles. And the task is you show two of them, and you say, are these two the same or not? Really an identity task, so really a what pathway task. The second task was a grasp task, so really a how task. You show someone one of these little marbles. In fact, you dip them in soap before doing this, and then you see where they place their thumb and their index in order to grasp it. And obviously, in order to grasp it correctly and not to lose it when you put soap on them, you have to put your thumb and your index such that the line uniting them passes through the center of the object, else it'll squeeze away. If you look here at these two drawings, this is a correct grasp with the line between the thumb and the index going through the center, whereas this is an incorrect grasp. And if you did this, and if indeed there were soap and water on the marble, it would you'd lose it. So let's see how the two patients perform. Now, when you look at the recognition task, you see exactly the expected effect. DF, who has an impairment in the ventral pathway, seems to be unable to tell whether two marbles have the same shape or not. Her performance is just about a chance. And this is true both for the cases where the two marbles had the same shape, the white bar, versus when two marbles had a different shape, the blue bar. On the other hand, RV, who has an intact Watt pathway, she seems to be pretty good at determining whether two shapes look the same or not, whether the shapes of two marbles, rather, are the same or not, both when they have the same shape and when they don't have the same shape. So clearly, RV can recognize the shape of something. DF, on the other hand, is impaired at that. But let's look at the grasp task. Now, if you were to ask a number of healthy volunteers, and if you did this yourself, on average, you would see that you'd be pretty good at placing your thumb and index such that the line uniting them passes right through the center, as you can see in these examples. Now, if you ask DF to do the same task, on average, she does pretty well. You can see right here that her thumb and index tend to set a line that passes right through the center of the marble that allow her to grasp correctly the object. And it's incredible. We've just saw that DF, if you show her a shape, is unable to identify it. She cannot tell if two shapes are the same or not. And yet, her how brain is perfectly able to take it to grasp correctly an object. The exact converse happens with RV. RV can tell you if two shapes are the same or not, so RV clearly can determine that two things look the same or whether they don't, but seems to be unable to pick the little marble in the appropriate way. So in the case of RV, she can recognize the identity of something, but she's unable to interact with it, which means she's unable to know how to interact with it. So taken together, this led to the idea that there are these two and a half pathways. The ventral pathway definitely maps onto the identity, trying to resolve the identity of what we're looking at, whereas the dorsal pathway seems to have actually two pathways within it. A where, something important for determining where something is in space, and a what, and a how, something to allow us to understand how to interact with a certain object.